Can you guys see the recording view? Does it look like it's recording? Great. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tom, for coming here. This is Professor Tom Davenport. He probably doesn't need an introduction, as we've gone through several of his books, Keeping Up with the Quants, The AI Advantage, and then winning, How to Win with Data Analytics. So we've taken portions of it and also your HBR articles. But for the general audience, he's a visiting professor at Oxford. He's also a distinguished professor at Babson College and has previously been a professor at Harvard as well. But in industry, he's worked as a director or partner at Accenture, McKinsey, and Deloitte. So he's a wide and deep background, and he's written through many different technology waves.
Are you saying?
What's that?
Are you saying I'm old?
No. Wise, I should say.
There you go. I like that much better. Yeah.
No, but so anyways, we were so lucky and grateful to have Tom here to speak with us and hopefully introduce him to our audience. And so, and maybe without further ado, I mean, there's a lot that we could talk about Tom, but maybe he can give a more personal and more color on his background and how he came to sort of this moment in time.
Sure. So yeah, I'm academically trained as a sociologist, which is not the most common background for somebody doing things in analytics and AI. But I don't know. I ended up writing papers in sociology for 5 or so people in the world, and I wasn't really content with that. So I started. I got into consulting. I worked for a strategic IT consulting firm. I liked it, but what I really liked was the kind of the thought leadership part, the writing and speaking and so on. So since then, I've gone back and forth between consulting firms and business schools. I like both. I don't really want to work for a consulting firm, but I don't mind hanging out with them and advising them, and I do that with Deloitte now. But I've done a whole variety of things related to technology and business, business process reengineering. For those of you who are old enough to remember it, I was involved in quite early on, and then I did some work in ERP, enterprise resource planning systems, and how to get value out of them. Then I did knowledge management for a number of years, and then I decided that, well, an important type of knowledge that people aren't really thinking that much about in at least kind of organizational, behavioral, cultural terms is knowledge derived from data. So I started to do this work on how companies compete on analytics and so on. I would probably have given that up a long time ago, but it turned out to be much more popular than I ever anticipated. So I did that for about 10 years, and then big data came along. I did that for about 5 years, and then AI came along. I've been doing that for about, 6 or 7 years. It's all basically the same thing. Analytics, big data, AI, it's all basically quite similar with a few little wrinkles here and there, but so that's what I write books. I talk to companies a lot. Occasionally I do consulting. I do more executive education than consulting, but I like mixing it up with organizations. I'm really bad, sort of pure academic. I don't really like doing things for other academics.
I hear you. No, thank you, Tom, for that brief introduction. And so the format maybe today that might be useful for our audience here is we'll have a little bit of a fireside chat, and then in the middle of this, we'll start introducing some of the cohort here. So I'll reintroduce them later. So we've got Jimmy here, who's the Deputy CEO of the Hallett Group, South Australia's largest construction materials supply company. We've got Amy here from Volkswagen, Nancy from Citibank, and Olivia from PwC. And some of the questions we have will basically revolve just sort of, maybe a State of the Union address. What's your view of the AI, machine learning in 2022? Where do you see it going in 5 years, 10 years? Some broad questions, and then we'll sort of dive a little bit into how companies that are not as data-driven and how they might be able to approach that. And I think we'll let Jimmy and some of the other students who actually have decision-making power. And Jimmy has a great story where from his entrepreneurship course, he was able to spend maybe $100,000, but got back $3 million in return. So we're, hopefully maybe there's some low-hanging fruit that you might be able to help direct some of the executives here. So maybe we'll just start with sort of, so I think the last book, as far as I know, that's on your website was The AI Advantage, and that was in about 2017-18. I was wondering, maybe we'll just start there and sort of how have things changed? What has aged well? What has not? And maybe we'll just kick it off.
Yeah, well, I think I haven't read that book in a while, but I think it's aged reasonably well. But I'm sort of bored with it because I have 3 new books that are about to come out, all of which are coming out, I don't know, September, October, November, or something like that. And so that I normally what I would do in a relatively new area is I would start with writing a book like the AI Advantage, sort of enterprise use of a particular technology like AI. But when I first started focusing on AI, there weren't that many big enterprise-related activities. So I wrote another book about the relationship between humans and machines. There are a lot of books on that topic, but mine was called Only Humans Need Apply, Winners and Losers in the Age of Smart Machines, I think was the subtitle. And so I did that for a while. I think that was 2016. And then I found a fair number of companies who were starting to do some things. So I did the AI Advantage. And now the 3 books that I've pretty much finished, except for, little copy editing here and there. One is kind of like competing on analytics, only it's about AI. So it's going to be called All In on AI. And it's companies that are really aggressive in their adoption of AI and are really using it to compete and are, making big bets on it. One is also related to that idea of humans and machines, which is it's going to be called Working with AI, and it's people who 29 case studies and then a number of chapters of sort of lessons learned of people who work with AI on a daily basis. I co-authored that with an academic from Singapore, so there's a fair amount of Southeast Asia stuff in it. But whole variety of jobs from, I don't know, insurance underwriter to digital weeders. Somebody works with an AI machine that weeds crops to, I don't know, pharmacists, dermatologists, 29 different jobs, basically. And then the third one is about, it's sort of called Advanced Introduction to AI in Healthcare, which is a really interesting area for me. So, I don't know if that answers your question, Lamont.
Oh no, no, that's fine. No, that's great. I didn't know that you were coming out with these three new books, but that's exciting. I think
you were probably thinking that guy's gotten a little lazy. The AI Advantage is getting a little long in the tooth.
No. I mean, I knew something must have been coming. Actually, that's one of the things I was going to ask was, sort of what's coming down the pipeline, and it sounds like you've got quite a lot. Maybe you could introduce just a little bit of the maybe highlight some of the things. So there are some people in healthcare. I also have a background in pharmaceuticals and biotech. I'm curious. I remember reading something where you feel like in the healthcare space, maybe where the value is for organizations is maybe not so much on the clinical side because of the long R&D cycles and then implementation cycles, but maybe it might be on the administrative side. Does that still hold, or?
Well, I believe that there's a lot to be said for working on the clinical side as well, but it is very time consuming. Most of the efforts are taking place in research labs and not at the patient's bedside yet. And I think it's going to be quite a while before AI gets developed enough and approved enough by regulatory bodies and integrated into clinical workflows so that we see a lot of it on the clinical side. On the administrative side, it's sort of, I guess I'm a fairly big advocate of if there's low-hanging fruit, why not pick it? And at least in the US, and I think in other countries as well. In the US, we have ridiculously expensive healthcare for only moderately good outcomes. And there's a huge opportunity to use AI to provide better service at lower cost. And so I'm a big advocate of that. I mean, some of it is just really, some of what's being done with AI on the administrative side is really quite silly. We in the US, I hope you don't do this in Australia, but we still use faxes a fair amount in healthcare in the US. And so some companies have figured out a way to extract the relevant data from faxes, they figured out how much money it saves for each fax to avoid a human looking through it. But you shouldn't be using faxes at all. It's crazy. So, we have some AI systems that work on the healthcare provider side, and they call other AI systems that work on the payer side to say, "Where's my money?" Yeah, that's not the way to do business. Have your AI call my AI, and they really do. It's telephone calls in many cases with chatbots. So, but in general, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Ultimately, I think that the clinical side is much more exciting and interesting, but you do what you can at that particular time.
Yeah, no, that's as trained as a neuroscientist, and so actually that's actually one of the things that was sort of a little bit contradictory to sort of my notions of like, oh yeah, this is sort of the interesting side, but I guess from a real business point of view, it's just good to hear sort of a against the grain type of view. I was curious about any other type of not contrarian views that you might have that run against the narrative that you think that our students or our executives and managers should know in 2022.
Well, I mean, in general, I think that I've always been a fairly pragmatic person, and AI, of course, is full of hype, and so and I try to be empirical about it. And so I remember talking to a number of companies early on with AI who had taken on very ambitious projects, in healthcare. Curing cancer was, the IBM Watson mission, and a number of the early customers or partners for Watson basically were saying, "Oh yeah, we pretty much done that already." It's really horrible amount of hype. I've done a lot of work. Probably the closest business to Australia is in Singapore at DBS Bank, which is, I think, a very well managed bank, very technically progressive, and they wanted to use, again, Watson to have a robo advisor that would recommend stocks and bonds for individual customers. And didn't work any better than the Watson for treating cancer did. And that's partly a function of Watson's shortcomings, but also the marketing got so far ahead of what the technology could do. I think the technology was okay, but not up to what the marketer said it could do. And then even at Amazon, arguably, one of the most technically astute organizations on our planet, they were going to use AI for autonomous drones. That's been promised since 2018. The Teslas of the world have been promising fully autonomous driving for God knows how long. I mean, I have a Tesla. Thank God I didn't pay in advance for full self-driving, or I'd feel so stupid. Because I think since 2016 or so, it's been an extra cost option, and it's never delivered. I would have gotten rid of my Tesla by then. So I am much more of an advocate of picking the low-hanging fruit when you can, as I said, and sometimes I think I wrote a piece once called "In Praise of Boring AI," that a lot of the applications are quite boring, but if you do enough of them, I say think big, start small. If you do enough things, you can show people what AI can do, and they want to do more. I was talking today to the head of AI for MasterCard, and he said, we believe in that philosophy of do small things with AI, and then people, think of new use cases, and eventually we kind of put them all together, and before you know it, we've revolutionized the way we do fraud detection, for example, with credit cards. So I don't know if that is a contrarian view or not, but I go by what works. And there have been a couple of moonshots. I don't know if you're familiar with these Amazon Go stores that have no cashier. That seems to have worked pretty well. For a while, they were the most expensive convenience stores on earth, but I think the price is coming down, and they're certainly an amazing achievement. But for the most part, it's the low-hanging fruit projects. And even in all those companies I mentioned, including Amazon, most of their focus is on more pragmatic, easier to accomplish projects. That Jeff Bezos said the great majority of our machine learning investments are devoted to, I think he called it quietly but meaningfully improving core operations.
No, thank you, Tom, for providing that color. I think just to extend that conversation, I mean, obviously there's a lot I'd personally love to talk to you about on the deep side and the deep tech of AI, but I think actually the practical side is really what's going to be appropriate for this audience here. A lot of them are, running organizations, and they just want to know, hey, what's the bottom line? What are things that, what are some key lessons we can take? I think one way, I don't know if you've seen the way Accenture has put this framework, but basically you've got on the x-axis, you've got work complexity from predictable rules-based type of work to unpredictable judgment-based type of tasks, like the Tesla that you mentioned. And then on the data side, you've got structured, that's super labeled, and then up on the y-axis you've got it goes up to unstructured, and then the 4 quadrants you've got efficient, which is sort of the low-hanging fruit, I think, is what you're sort of referring to. Those are the things that can be done easily. And then you've got effective models or strategies, and you've got the expert strategy, and then the 4th quadrant, which is sort of like where the sort of sexiness comes in, is the innovative part, where you have innovation, complete innovations in business models and so forth. I'm just curious, for the non-technical audience or executive managers, how would you are there strategic frameworks and how you would sort of help identify these opportunities for them, or are there useful ways of thinking about and identifying? Obviously, we introduced them very briefly into AI, but if they haven't been involved in it, how would they identify the appropriate opportunities, and is it relevant for them? Is it are there things that you can point them towards that would help them make those type of decisions and or investments into AI?
Sure. I mean, every year I do a survey with Deloitte of enterprise AI, and one of the questions that we've asked over and over again is sort of, what are your objectives with it? What are you trying to accomplish? And I would say, so I'll try to dispel the idea that I'm only interested in boring AI, but the most common objective, both achieved already and sought after, is improving existing business processes. Fine, not exciting, but if you make your marketing better, your supply chain inventory management, or your forecasting or whatever better, great. Second most common is improving decisions, since that's what your course is about. And again, I think that's kind of an extension of what we've done with analytics, but it's a good thing to do. And if you, I think AI is mostly about making decisions more, predictive rather than intuitive, predictive based on data. Certainly a good thing. The third most likely, which to me is more interesting, is starting to use AI to develop new products and services. A little bit further down the list in terms of commonality, but most interesting of all to me is the new business models idea, which you mentioned, Lamont. And in my new book, this All In on AI book, I focus a lot on companies that are really trying to develop new business models. Many of them, interestingly, are these sort of ecosystem or platform-based business models that have worked quite well for, these digital native companies, the Googles, the Airbnbs, the Facebooks, and so on. And so now these big companies are trying to change their business models as well in that direction. It's much harder, I think, when you're an existing company. I was talking today to the second largest health insurance company in the U.S., Anthem, and they've just said quite publicly, we're going to be a platform-based company that connects patients and health care providers. We're not going to necessarily provide the healthcare. We're going to make the connection, and we're going to use AI and analytics to ease the friction and do it virtually in many cases. But some companies have already done that. Ping An in China, I don't know if you're familiar with that. Good Doctor application that they have is really only one of their 5 ecosystems that they work in, but 400 million users of it, subscribers to it in China, and just enormously effective in terms of reducing visits to healthcare practitioners that don't need to happen, and keeping people from having to come into the doctor's office when they're feeling sick or in COVID or whatever. So just amazingly effective. And outside, they're applying that same technology, and I think Indonesia and Thailand is going to be next. But outside of those countries, we don't have anything nearly as effective elsewhere.
Thank you, Tom.
Would that be due to the fact that they got different maybe legal aspects? So say, for instance, if it happened in the US where the prediction came to the worst and someone did pass away, they're more likely to face a more legal objection compared to somewhere like in China?
Yeah, they're both, regulatory and malpractice related issues. You can get away with a lot in China. One of the other things that Ping An does, which my guess is would not be allowed in Australia, certainly not allowed in the United States, is they use facial recognition to decide how creditworthy you are in their banking ecosystem. And they think that they can tell, and I guess by your facial expression or how shifty your eyes look or whatever, how honest you are and how likely you are to pay back your loans, which I think is fairly ridiculous, but and would not be allowed by most financial regulators, but in China it's fine. So
thank you. So I think that conversation right there, where you label sort of the 4 or 5 things sort of in order of where you see opportunities. That's
by the way, I forgot to say, Lamont, that the lowest is replacing human labor,
right,
in that list of objectives, and it has been every year. There was one year where, and another question, 63%. It was just an American survey that year. 63% said we want to automate as many jobs as possible to cut costs, but it's always been the lowest level objective. Sorry to interrupt you.
No. That's a conversation I think Jimmy would like to have too, because I think he's looking to save costs there. But there's also this tension which will talk about sort of the future of skills. And as a manager and executive, what are the things that, as they navigate their own careers, what are things that, to watch out for, or where can they really add value and sort of focus on those areas. But before we go there, there were just a number of nuggets there that I maybe just want to touch upon. So I know there's not the majority of the cohort, but there is a good portion of the cohort that has an entrepreneurial streak. And I'm just curious, for that low-hanging fruit or any other quadrants in which value can be added, where do you think either entrepreneurship or startups can play a role? And I'm personally just curious in processes that are repeatable, that are scalable, and if you can use fraud detection in MasterCard, can you then do it for here we've got Nancy from Citibank or DBS or whatever. Is there a role for startups to play in making these type of innovations, or do you feel like it's got to be in-house for each organization to make those decisions because it's hard to have an outside influence? Or is there a way? Are there ways to where value can be sort of co-created? So,
I certainly think so, and I'm a little bit of a charlatan because I teach primarily at Babson, which is always rated the #1 MBA program for 29 straight years in entrepreneurship, but I mostly work with big companies. So but I do dabble in sort of AI entrepreneurship and talk about, what does it mean to have an AI minimum viable product? I was speaking yesterday with a friend who used to work for Deloitte in Canada, and she started a startup to use AI to change the way that contracts are signed, particularly in financial services. Goldman Sachs is one of their big clients, and I talked with one of their customers, and Goldman Sachs does all these kind of counterparty contracts, lots of negotiation back and forth. It ends up in a document that people may eventually try to suck the relevant data out of, but why not do it early on? So this company uses workflow and AI, eventually some machine learning, to try to structure the process of contract development and negotiation. And the people who do this work are, for the most part, lawyers, not noted for their embrace of new technology. I just don't think that it would happen within Goldman Sachs or, JP Morgan Chase or Citi, for that matter. There's some exceptions. Some banks, Capital One in the U.S., quite progressive, doing a lot of interesting work. But in many cases, what you find is the innovation occurs through acquisition of those really innovative companies. I think I mentioned I was talking to MasterCard today, and they've acquired Brighterion for fraud detection, applied predictive technologies for kind of automated kind of A/B experimentation, dynamic yield for figuring out what sorts of retail settings really are most likely to succeed. They bought them from McDonald's, of all places, who acquired them in the first place. So I think both through collaborations and through acquisition, these big enterprise companies can really innovate much more effectively if they do it with startups.
Thanks. And then circling back to sort of those 4 or 5 areas. So, we'll get to new business model innovations last, and sort of these platforms. Before we go there, I was just curious, for strategic or for strategy, have you seen good examples where AI has now come into play in setting KPIs, predictive KPIs? Or I'm just curious, has that come to the forefront yet, or not quite yet?
You mean in deciding what KPIs are important? And,
Yeah, because let's say
yeah.
let's say you're marketing analytics and you have great detail on sort of where eyeballs are. You can drill down and for this quarter, this is where you should send your budget on, and this is where this is the geography you should target, this is the customer you should be targeting, and this is what they predict. Not just where they should spend money, but that's based on that spending, this is what they should get, and then this is what their KPI should be. Has that, I'm just curious, like, are there other areas where AI has come to sort of start building out those predictive KPIs, or is that sort of it's not there yet?
I think if you're talking about supervised machine learning, then you have to have a lot of data, and you have to know what the outcome is in order to train your models in the training data and the testing data to see if it's working or not. So I haven't seen too many cases of people developing new KPIs, but certainly I think AI has started to change the types of KPIs that people use. I was talking with MasterCard about this today, and apparently, I didn't get a whole lot of detail from the head of AI, but he said they have finally been able to do a predictive model of just how many, transactions and what volume of currency they will pass through MasterCard with a machine learning model. And it's because, they could always do it, and they had the internal transaction data that they could extrapolate, but putting all of the internal and external factors together, the macroeconomic data of various types was just too complex for humans to do. The machine learning model does it quite well, and they have like 99% accuracy of their forecasts now. And then I saw a little while ago, I was working with a company, a charter jet company based in California, and they again started using external data to try to predict demand for charter flights. And they found a database of, I don't know what it's called, events that rich people like to go to. In the US, the Masters in golf and the US Open and the Kentucky Derby, sports related things, the Westminster Dog Show for dog lovers, and people who would take these charter jets. And then they also found a database of where all jets are located at the moment, and so they can start to see, okay, there's nobody anywhere near Augusta, Georgia, where they have the Masters, and the Masters is ending. So we can charge a huge amount of money to fly people back to wherever they came from, using this external data combined with knowledge of where their own planes were. So I think it's really partly it's the availability of machine learning tools, but it's also this explosion of external data that many companies have available now. And Peter Drucker used to say, these information systems are great. I'm trying to sort of slide into his Austrian accent, but they're only internal. They don't tell you anything about what's happening in the world at large. But that's not true anymore. That's a big change, I think. And obviously, you have all that data, you've got to find some way to make sense of it, and machine learning is a great way to do it.
Excellent. So this, I think there's two more things I want to ask you. There's lots I would love to ask, but I would like to turn it over to the group. We'll do like a fishbowl where each of them can sort of ask their own questions for maybe 3 to 5 minutes. And then so in regards to the last thing where you're most interested in, where new business model innovation, maybe this also plays into a thought experiment on how AI might change strategy. So one thing that's been proposed is sort of, for example, e-commerce could move from a model from shopping, then shipping, to shipping, basically shipping to you, and then you can shop as a consumer, because Amazon and these other e-commerce companies know so much data about what your preferences are, where you've been hanging out, what are the things that you might be likely to buy. So I'm obviously have to solve for the problem of like handling returns, but if at some point the predictive algorithms are so good at predicting consumer wants and what they're going to buy, they just arrive at your door and they can sort of, that might be where the business model changes and then strategy changes as a result of that. So we'd love to hear sort of what do you see now in 2022 or the next 5 years, where business models are ripe for this type of innovation?
Yeah, I've read, speculation about that items will be shipped to you and the predictions will be so accurate. I just find it really hard to believe that this will not create an astronomical increase in return costs. It's funny. I wrote a little piece recently about personalization and what AI is doing for personalization. And we've been talking about personalization for such an incredibly long time. And I don't know about you, but the vast majority of offers that I get are really not very well crafted. I mean, maybe it's retargeting. I looked at something before, so I must still be interested in that, whether I bought it or not. Or, maybe it's I was interested in something related at one point, or I did a Google search for something, and so Google starts showing me ads, but it's just really not very sophisticated. So I think it's really hard for us to anticipate all of the contextual factors that might be going on in someone's mind when they buy something or when they look at an ad or whatever. So I don't know. I hope it will get better. We waste a huge amount of money and effort in marketing for these horrible offers that we get. But for the most part, I don't know. Once I got an offer, I think it was from this company Groupon, for a restaurant that I really wanted to go to, and it's almost a tear almost rolled down my cheek because I'd never had that experience before. Something I really wanted, I got an offer for. So maybe that will happen. I would be surprised. Other types of new business models, I think, again, not terribly interesting areas, but I've been working with Shell some, and they now do plant and refinery inspection in a totally different way with drones and automated image analysis and problem recognition from drone images is totally reshaping. I mean, it used to take humans 6 months to go through a refinery. Now it takes a day or so to fly a drone all through the pipes and everything. So in some of those not very exciting areas, I think there's dramatic change going on. Shell says that they are doing some great work in, moving us out of a, carbon-based energy environment. But to be honest, I haven't seen kind of dramatic change that we need in that area from things like AI. It's much more on the margins there.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, no, I think this might be a good segue. I'll ask the last question, which is responsible management. That's one of the things that we are priding ourselves here. I'll save that maybe to the last bit because you've mentioned Shell and sort of maybe unsexy areas, and maybe this is where I can introduce some of the cohort here. So I've now forgotten if I've already introduced, but so maybe I'll start off with this Jimmy, who is the deputy CEO of the Hallett Group. South Australia's largest construction material supply. And maybe you can give a little color, Jimmy. And then also Olivia is working at PwC in the energy sector. And then we can go to Amy or Nancy. Amy's from Volkswagen, or it was, and then Nancy from Citibank. So each of you guys will have like 3 minutes, 5 minutes to just ask away.
My two main questions revolved. You did touch on CO2 emissions and all this push for renewable energy. We're currently being forced through basically the European sector introduced something called environmental product data. So it's currently getting introduced into Australia at the moment. So we're going through and seeing all parts of our business, from the manufacturing of the cement all the way through to transporting the material and being concrete to site. And they calculate this predictive CO2 rate. Only problem is that nobody actually knows what this data means. So we've produced all this data that nobody's actually got an idea on what the use for it is. Do you see that happening more and more with all this production of data, that people just jump to the first allotment of data produced and introduce stuff without actually knowing what that data is going to cause? One, with the economic factors, because if basically it costs, I would say, a quarter more to produce this kind of concrete than it does the typical concrete. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think there are two things going on. One is that we're at the very early stages of being able to create decent quality data about sustainability, environmental sustainability related issues. And as you say, our predictions of how much carbon are generated by this product or that activity, not very good. But in a way, I think that's okay, because right now we don't have a very good way yet to do much about many of the activities that we pursue. We don't have enough electrical energy created by sustainable sources to make steel, for example. We haven't figured out a really low emissions way to make concrete yet. So I think it's fine that we are still sort of finding our way on the data side, because we don't know yet what to do about it. I think when we have more sustainable energy sources, renewable sources that we can store, Australia will be good in this regard, because it doesn't rain very much. When it rains a lot, I gather, as it has been recently. But I think we're still going to need some way to store all of that. And really, where you find analytics and AI is in kind of the optimization. When does it make sense to put a battery into a large-scale battery into a grid? When does it make sense to put another windmill into a windmill farm? AI can do that kind of optimization on the margins, but the really big issues, I think it's not quite up to the task yet.
And probably my next question is, in terms of innovation, data analytics, entrepreneurship, if I was to create a job role to bring somebody in the business to do all this, what are the key aspects I need to look at, and what skills will they need to have so I can benefit the most by that employment?
Is it only one person, or can it be a whole team?
It can be a whole team. So basically, like, we want to hire a chief innovation officer to begin with, and then if we need some other teams below him, or if they can be internal, what are the major skills to bring in to create this, and try and pick off some of that low hanging fruit to maybe creating a new product, or getting that new unicorn into the market?
Yeah, well, and I think at a general level, for certainly the higher level position you're describing, is sort of the ability to make that connection between what's possible with AI and what the business needs in order to advance. And so that means you've got to have a pretty good understanding of what are the possible use cases with AI, what are other organizations doing, just how hard is it to do certain things, what's feasible right now and what isn't yet. And then it's got to be somebody who's a pretty good strategist who can figure out, how could we move the needle on the organization's performance, and how could AI facilitate that? Lower level, I think, I don't know if you read this article, but 10 years ago, I co-authored an article in Harvard Business Review about data scientists, which nobody remembers, but some people remember the subtitle, which was "Sexiest Job of the 21st Century." And now it's not the sexiest job, it's the sexiest job family in a sense, because you've got data scientists, you've got machine learning engineers, you've got data engineers, you've got translators who can kind of connect with the business, you've got product managers who are, make sure this actually gets deployed and maintained well over time. So it's become, I think, a team responsibility. There are no unicorns that can do the whole thing. So that means that companies have to start saying, okay, what are these specific skills that we want, and how do we identify them? How do we sort of certify that people have them? What are the career paths that people would want? So it's a fair amount of kind of human resources work, frankly.
Oh, fantastic, thank you.
Thank you, Tom and Jimmy. Does anybody else want to step in with their questions?
I have a question.
Great.
So I have worked for the last 5 years for Volkswagen in education and training. And so in the automotive industry, there's a real focus on transitioning skills across their existing workforce. And in that time, because of COVID, we have moved from doing face-to-face training to online training. And with online training, we've got all of this new analytics that we never had access to before. We can see engagement stats, we can see and then we can look at different roles and see how they're improving and then relate that to other business data. I guess my broader question is, how can we use analytics? What's the role of analytics in education more broadly? And is there a role for AI within an education context?
Yeah, no, I think there is, and particularly for online learning of things that are sort of more or less factual and fairly structured educational content. You have this idea of adaptive learning that human instructors have a very difficult time dealing with even a single classroom of people saying, oh, this person's learning faster than that one, and they need different types of content, and what do I do? Rip up the textbook and hand it? My wife was a teacher at one point, and she really did do this, ripping up the textbook, and I said, no, there's got to be a better way. But there are a lot of educational technology companies now offering adaptive learning that will keep track of what every individual is learning, give them harder content, easier content, different types of content even. I think we need to get better at different learning styles and different content for different learning styles and so on. But I think adaptive learning is the way to do that, and it is AI oriented. And by the way, I was talking today with an old friend who is an automobile industry analyst, and he said, I'm trying to figure out what is the new tech stack for automobile companies. And I told him about my friend who just bought a Porsche Taycan, part of the Volkswagen family. And he said, oh, these people are lousy at building software, and the car is all software. That's the problem. It's batteries and software. So it's a whole new set of skills that need to be developed. Tesla has great analytics people and great software people and so on. A lot of the other more traditional automobile manufacturers in the US, and I suspect Volkswagen as well, just haven't had to have that and need to transition pretty rapidly. I know you didn't ask that question, but I thought I'd throw it in anyway.
I think it's really interesting because what do you do with an existing workforce that's changing really quickly?
And I think that, the best answer I've seen to that is at Unilever, where they say, we can't really anticipate all of the things that any individual worker will need to know, or even what they want to do. So how could we advise them? But if we give them a lot of advice about, choosing a future career path, and then a lot of resources for what they would need to do to succeed, to know and do to succeed in that career path, that's the best we can do. And I think that is a great strategy. I don't know how far along they are. And the woman who was head of HR at Unilever was apparently setting the place on fire, doing great work, and she got hired away as a CEO. So I don't know if it will continue.
Great.
But if you want to be head of HR and become a CEO, it's a pretty good strategy to do what she did.
Thank you, Tom and Amy. Olivia, or sorry, Nancy or Olivia?
Yeah, I've got one for Tom. So I love keeping up with the quants. I love the name, but I particularly love, the sections where you talk about good questions about quantitative analysis. So what can you ask, the analyst? What was the outliers? So I've been trying to use that, what are the assumptions? Why did you use that approach? But if I were to flip the script, say I've got a scenario, for example, where my analysts can't find any correlation. Let's say we've got a very small sample size. We've acquired, let's say, 100,000 customers, and bad debts default rates are higher than we expected. And everyone is running around and go, what were the drivers? What rules can we change in our credit policy that would reduce bad debt? But we haven't found, or based on the skills that we have or the internal data that we haven't landed on like a magic bullet that goes, okay, if I, let's say, stop acquiring people that look shifty in the facial recognition, we haven't found sort of a driver, I would say, or something that would, because I suspect the sample size is small and so forth. I wondered if you've been in a situation, Tom, I know you don't do a lot of consulting directly, but in a situation where there hasn't been, it's about managing stakeholders where you haven't seen any strong correlation, and how do we set expectations about, well, we got to wait and see, or we have to monitor, and what's the...
Well, yeah, I mean, if you really do have 100,000 customers and you know who's defaulted and who hasn't, that should be enough. I wouldn't take no for an answer there. And, one of the things that's changing now is with these automated machine learning tools, you can say, okay, I want to predict who's going to default. Here's a data set with a ton of different features or variables. Find out what really matters. You don't even need a human to do it, and you'll have some interesting answers in a relatively short time. And the people who understand the business, I think, are likely to do as well or better at that kind of analysis than a data scientist who doesn't really understand your customers or your business problems and so on. So I think turning some people loose with those new tools make those fishing expeditions for what really matters far more productive and effective. And as I say, 100,000, not a bad number at all for that kind of work. So try it out. I mean, there are a lot of these tools that are available to people now. Some come from the cloud vendors like AWS and Microsoft Azure and so on. Some are from startups like DataRobot and H2O and so on, but they really open up the possibilities quite dramatically for finding out what's going on in a data set.
Okay. Might be that we haven't found the right, either we haven't picked up, maybe it's to do with the data or the right tools or the right skill set, perhaps, to pick out or unpick. Or could it be an external factor? Let's say there's a trend, like an external factor, as in, a hypothesis in Australia right now, post-COVID, there's been a lot of, COVID relief, like incentives, and now that has stopped, and it could be an external factor.
Well, there's no doubt that COVID threw a wrench into a lot of analytics and AI. Machine learning uses past and predictive analytics of any type uses data from the past to predict the future. And COVID data from the past was not a very good predictor of how people were behaving in the present and the future. So that's not surprising. By the way, speaking of Citi doesn't do it anymore, which I think is unfortunate, but there was a group at Citi for a long time that had a really close tie between decision making and analytics. It was called decision management, and every business unit had a decision management person. I think it's very sad that it kind of lapsed over time, but it was a really good way to kind of bring analytics and data into managerial decision processes.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Nancy and Tom. And Nancy, that would have been a great final project, but I'm not sure, that might have been sensitive data. So I want to be cognizant of time. Just wanted to thank you again, Tom. I just want to close out with maybe just a few rapid fire questions. What are some lessons, important frameworks, strategics, or skills that for MBAs, managers, and executives that you would like them to take away?
Well, I think the one that will be more prevalent in the future than it is today is this, this translation, this intermediation between the hardcore analytical work, much of which will be automated, I think, and understanding the business. So if you have that domain knowledge and you have enough quantitative skills to kind of make some sense of what's happening in a machine learning model, I think those are going to be the skills that are really most valuable in the future, even more than data scientists. It may become the sexiest job of the latter half of the 21st century.
Yeah, we actually emphasize the data translator in our course. All right, well, do something. So what is something fun you like to do?
I like to play tennis, which isn't all that interesting. I like to ride motorcycles, but my wife really does not like for me to ride motorcycles, so I don't do it as much as I would enjoy. And I like to sail. I think those are, two sort of old white guy activity, three old white guy activities, not terribly interesting.
Is that in Cape Cod?
Cape Cod and in Santa Barbara.
In Santa Barbara, so, nice. Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
What's a fun fact that people might not know?
I often say that I once ate 29 jalapeno peppers in 60 seconds in a college jalapeno pepper eating contest, and I won. I was the winner. So I don't know. My son is a TV comedy writer. I have another son who makes wooden surfboards and also does AI research for Accenture. So they're more interesting than I am generally. So.
Thank you, Tom. No, that's wonderful. So we'll make sure not to get into the jalapeno eating contest with you. So with that, we'll end this wonderful interview. And thank you again, Tom. And hopefully we'll have a chance to touch bases or meet again. We'd love to invite you down here, down under.
Someday. I'd love to be down there, but it's been a while. So.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tom. And
Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
Sure.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.